Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. My name is James Batchelor and thank you very much for joining us on these live broadcasts on the Car Dealer Magazine YouTube channel. Now today on the show, I'm delighted to say we've got James Litton. Hello, James.
Hello, Batch. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Lovely to have you on. I'm surprised it's taken us 77 odd shows to actually get round to one of our columnists. It shows you there's been so many people to talk to during the past few weeks and months.
Well, you've been working on a hierarchy of aesthetical qualities and you're finally getting into the bargain basement of looks. my face is probably best suited to writing columns as opposed to appearing on video, but it's lovely to be here with you.
Well, it's lovely to have you on. And if anybody is looking at the current digital issue of Car Dealer Magazine and comparing it to the video chat we've got with James at the moment, thinking he doesn't look like that, well, that's what lockdown does to all of us. Yeah. Now, obviously, James is, he's a columnist in our magazine for 10 years, amazingly. He's been observing and commenting on the industry for that period of time. He's an automotive retail consultant. He is and has been at the coalface. He's had spells as general manager at Volvo Cars in Poole, sales manager at various Mercedes-Benz dealerships, and he was the owner of his very own used car business way back sort of around 10 years ago or so.
Yes.
Now we're going to be on the air for the next 20 or so minutes. This is a live show, obviously, so if you do want to get in touch and put a question to James, then please do pop it into the comments box and I'll do my best to ask it to him.
I just had one of those off at the pass patch. I do my own hair. That's if someone's going to ask, I do my own hair.
Okay.
That's an important one to get out of the way before we kick off.
I do my own hair as well, which is why it looks so terrible, but there we are. So, 10 years you've been writing for Car Dealer. I turned up at Car Dealer 10 years ago as well, so we've got a bit of a joint celebration going on here as well. Yes. I've spent some time away from this side of the industry, working on a consumer title. I'm back this year, and the thing that has amazed me in the last 10 years is how different things are, but also there are a few things that are the same. So, I mean, a bit of a difficult question to answer, but what do you think of the last 10 years that you've been writing?
Well, I think that is a bold question to kick off with. I think you're absolutely right. The way in which we go to market has definitely changed. You know, the business that I started back in 2007 and how I got to know you guys by writing a blog on my own website was at that time an internet car-based business. So we didn't have any traditional premises. We kept cars in a barn and we just took inquiries from Auto Trader and on the phone. And it didn't necessarily work out at that time for probably a couple of different reasons. But you look at that sort of 13 years ago when that started and look at where we are today, people are now sort of starting to title salespeople as digital salespeople and kind of showroom salespeople. In reality, a lot of it hasn't necessarily changed. These kind of platforms and these ways to market have been around. It's just the acceptance from a retail audience has definitely become much more prevalent, and the idea that they'll buy a car, even from independents, not just necessarily franchise dealers, but they'll buy cars from independents, 200-300 miles away. They're more aware of their consumer rights with returning cars. And I think there was always a fear that if the car arrived, it wasn't like it was supposed to be, what do I do now? And I think that just with the whole sort of COVID world that we're in today, it feels like a lot of that stuff has accelerated that kind of path. But actually, I think it was there, and it was probably there in a fairly big way. It's just people were less willing to acknowledge it, and I think manufacturers were probably a bit less willing to kind of acknowledge that, you know, there are multiple different platforms that people inquire on, and, you know, this kind of single price policy, particularly around new cars, you know, single pricing policy potentially kind of working its way through various OEMs at the moment. And I think that's probably the one thing that was necessary to help the whole customer journey to that digital transition. But in reality, as you say, it's not really changed that much. It's probably just been accelerated a little bit in the past, and there's probably a bit more acknowledgement through name calling and kind of internal processes, really, I would say. But the key fact is, James, people see car, interested in car, We try to sell car, be as good as we can be, manage expectations, and deliver car. That hasn't changed from when my dad started in the motor trade in 1958. And if my sons decide to, go down the dark path of joining the motor trade, then it probably won't be any different for them in 2058. But it's just the whole kind of how we do it is probably has modified a little bit.
Yeah, no, totally. I was thinking the other day, one of the first sort of big stories that sort of broke when I joined Car Dealer was Tesco Cars, and how that mode of selling primarily on the internet was, they arrived with a huge amount of fanfare. A lot of people like you and I were saying this is going to change the motor trade, and it's life-changing, really. And of course, as we know, that operation's unfortunately fizzled out and has been replaced by other brands that have come in. But I suppose that was an example of that brand being ahead of the curve in the motor trade, because at the moment there are brands that are doing exactly the same thing, and the motor trade has caught up with that trend, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I spoke about it at the time. Funnily, I've had a bit of a sort of spat with the famous Ling from Ling's Cars, and she particularly was.
We all have, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're not carrying your card of motor trade acceptance if you've not had a fight with Ling at some point. But she was sort of saying that this is because their data capturability and their huge wealth of personal data that they could target. This was going to be a real game changer, and as I said at the time, as Richard Branson found, it is a very different, particularly in the used car world. The new car world has maybe transitioned that way eventually, but for used cars, which was their sort of initial foray into the market, it's very hard to have the right supply channels to get the cars at the right money in the first place, to then offer a saving to a consumer, which is initially the way you buy yourself into the market. As much as they had the brand, it wasn't like it was Fortnum and Mason or Harrods, where the brand credibility was strong enough to just make people buy the vehicles. There would have needed to be something else. And I wrote a piece recently about Alex Chesterman from Kazoo, again, with people sort of speculating that with someone with that kind of background and real sort of disruptor sort of ability, how much that was going to change, again, the used car landscape with, 50 quid deposits and return the car in 7 days, all those kind of things. But again, I wrote at that point, unless they change the sort of the fundamental model that they're operating with, they won't be anything more than a sort of fly swatting around the big thing, because people like choice, people like to look at cars, and whilst again, we might be talking about a natural evolution over time, and people, the younger Gen Y, Gen Z buyers might become more willing to do that kind of stuff. A lot of the people with the money are people who come from the baby boomer generation or the Generation X generation. And there's a lot of traditional buying behaviour rooted in those individuals. And it was interesting to see your kind of scoop that they'd bought Imperial car supermarkets, very much to complement this sort of omni-channel approach that, most people are talking about. Because as they probably would have experienced in the first few months of trading, it was always going to be hard. And that may have been a long-term sort of strategic objective for them anyway. But I think they probably found initially that, crikey, this is actually a bit harder than it looks, particularly as much as, the brand of Zoopla would be known. And if you had called it Zoopla Cars, fine, that might have had a bigger impact. But to create a new brand with no history or no kind of background at all, it was a brave thing to do. And I think, it's going to take some time to establish that brand. So yeah, I think it's very hard. The Car Wow, We Buy Any Car, they're the two biggest kind of disruptors, I would say, over the last 10 years that I've seen. Everyone else kind of trying slightly new models to deliver to market. They're more nuanced changes, which might just be more in keeping with customer trend, as opposed to really blowing the whole thing up and kind of, really doing something radical. Because to me right now, that's probably more of a new car thing. For example, if an OEM decided to sign up to Amazon or one of these kind of online platforms and said, that's it, unit price is that, it's fixed, you can buy it from any number of platforms, that would be a really sort of disruptive thing to do. But obviously they've all got networks to protect and profitability within those networks to protect. So I can't see that happening anytime soon, frankly.
Do you think there's a real danger, though, that the generation beneath me. I am younger than I look. The generation beneath me, they're not car buyers, are they? They're if I've spent a lot of time working in London, and the vast majority of young people that I knew, if they needed a car, they'd go down the road and hire a zip car. The
Yes.
idea of the younger generation actually going into a car showroom these days and buying a car is dwindling already, and it's only going to get worse, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but I think that's an assumption that too many people make, and especially at the manufacturer level, because often the people that are making those decisions could be in centralized European locations where they might be in major hub cities, where they probably are seeing, a transference to, a car sort of not away from car ownership and to car usership. So, and there's definitely, it's happening in the UK, Bristol, London, Birmingham, those kind of cities. But I think there's a tendency within OEMs to forget, countries are made up of vast territories. And whilst that might be right in urban environments, there is a lot of car dealerships operating in sort of more provincial sort of settings. And, I certainly see it here. I'm working in the Southwest, and, yes, and with a brand like Mercedes, with an Aspire, a car like an A-Class, it's easy to assume that everyone who's sort of buying an A-Class under the age of 30 is only coming to the dealership at the point of collection. But that's not true, because in reality, especially in today's world, there's actually not a huge amount to fill the void of sort of, not being able to go out into the cinema and clubs and all this sort of stuff. So they'll consider the brand of, or the consideration amongst brands maybe smaller, but I still think there's a genuine interest for these guys to go out and actually touch and feel it and just see, as much to reinforce their decision, even though they might be further down the decision process than my parents would have been, where they would have started out with a blank sheet of paper on a Saturday, trawled around a number of different car dealers and met different car salesmen and ended up with a car. These guys are much more, they're much more qualified. They know what they want, and their consideration of brands is much less. They only consider one or two. But I still think there's a physical, tactile element to that sort of process, which means the physical infrastructure for networks is probably in its sort of, not necessarily in its current form, but certainly largely in its form, is going to be here to stay for a while, because you need to support that. And certainly in the premium sector, you can't offer premium products with premium monthly payments or premium cash prices and expect to do that completely via an online channel, not with the type of purchase and the size of purchase. A bit different with maybe some of the consumer goods. But even then, I'd warrant things like Bond Street. I don't know, pre-COVID, Bond Street is still like very, very busy, as is Savile Row, where there's bespoke offerings, there's high quality products being sold in those locations. A lot of car manufacturers have, even in the volume sector, they're still offering a very unique product that has a unique offering to that individual, and there's a lot of expertise that goes along with that product. And I think it's important for manufacturers particularly to remember that when it comes to decisions about networks. And we've seen lots of conjecture about what's happening with network sizes. Do they need to be rationalized, brought down in number, all this kind of stuff. And I think there is a case for some of that, but I think it's a brave brand that goes out there and risks a loss of market share by closing off lots of different outlets, because they will all have a need to fill new car volume. They've all got factories that are ready to get back on stream making cars as soon as possible, and they're going to need a way to sell and deliver those. And I don't think suddenly flipping the kind of online switch is going to be the answer. They can't suddenly say to Amazon, right, we're going to go to, let's say they're a 100 dealer network, we're going to go to 30 dealers and then do the rest in the territories through you guys. I don't think the buying public is ready for that transition. And I think that was, if I go back to those internet car lot days, that was my business. I think that was the thing. I was kind of ready for it. I felt like the world was ready for it. But actually, again, operating in the Southwest, I don't think the buying public were ready for it at quite that sort of stage. And again, it's taken 13 years for it to be a bit more accepted. So yeah, I think it's really interesting how this sort of stuff and how manufacturers and retailers perceive the challenges and perceive what should be done to overcome these voids.
I mean, it is easier for new car sales, though, isn't it, by having a fully functioning online sales service? Because the vast majority of people do their research online. They've watched a video review, they've read everything, and it ultimately comes down to, if they're interested in the VW Golf, it will come down to engine choice and monthly payments. Whereas with used cars, it's not quite so black and white, is it?
No.
People still like to actually touch and see. They like to see where the stone chips are. They like to see the car's history. And that's going to be the interesting thing, isn't it? Over the next few years, these big brands that are coming in, saying they're going to disrupt the used car market. Whether the used car buyer is actually be ready for that, that is going to be the interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that'll be the challenge. But I think, I just can't see how, because the fundamental thing that underpins a used car sort of operation is buy a car for X and sell it for Y. And unless the part of X changes fundamentally, and you have seen some changes with, We Buy Any Car and then BCA acquiring them to try and kind of have this sort of vertical integration to go from sort of soup to nuts. So if BCA suddenly said, right, that's it, we're opening retail used car centres, which they could do at some point, fine, that could be a bit more disruptive because they go from, cradle to grave, as it were, on that journey. But if people who operate outside of the motor industry think that the used car model is an easy one to target and think it's a very lucrative one to target, they'd be sadly mistaken, as most people watching this or kind of reading anything that we write in the magazines. There is a perception difference between people who work in the industry and people who work outside as far as used car margin potential. They look at gross margin, forget the VAT element of it, if it's a VAT qualifying car, and the preparation that goes into it. That there are huge costs that are just accepted because people won't accept a used car that's cheap but then covered in scratches and, as you say, paint chips and so on. I think the new car question is more sort of important, because if you look at a company like VAG, for example, you could ask yourself a question: why do they have 4 brands that essentially sell the same car with 4 different networks doing exactly the same thing? That is a big issue for the industry and for retailers in the future. That if VAG suddenly start to say, well, we don't see a place for Seat in the UK, and they were one that particularly they've had very good growth in the last couple of years, but it'll probably be partly at the expense of Volkswagen and partly at the expense of Skoda, so they're sort of cannibalizing their own brands. It's whether they start to say something like, we're only going to operate with 2 different brands in various bigger markets because of the cost of actually operating that infrastructure. But the problem is, and something that, again, I don't think people understand, is that when you've got governments involved in car manufacturing strategy, where factories are being subsidised, employees are being subsidised, tax breaks are given, there are so many various factors that go into an OEM's decision to operate and to sell in a certain country, that at the retailer level, sometimes we don't necessarily appreciate all of that. So we might say, oh, we can't take another X load of cars, or the new car market is being pushed, it's not being pulled, we need to go back to more of a pull situation. But the problem is, these budgets and targets and kind of financial plans have been set years and years ago, and it's very hard with the machines that are these big OEMs to suddenly be dynamic enough to stop that thing and then suddenly say, actually no, we're going to pivot and we're going to go and do something else. It's just very hard to do that. So I think that's what I'm really looking forward to sort of seeing in the next sort of couple of years, what these big how these big manufacturers consolidate their various brands, and especially when you've got into whole things about electric drive and so on, like how the investment is affected for lots of R&D work, because they're going to need to consolidate their balance sheets given what's happened in the last few months. So yeah, I think it's really popcorn time for the motor trade at the moment, just to sort of see how it all plays out.
No, I totally agree with you, and I think this is going to be the big thing in the next decade is what is the automotive scene going to look like in 2030? I very much believe that there are going to be some big brands that will disappear purely because they haven't been able to keep up with the pace of technology, primarily with electric cars. There will be more of these super brands that are created, with PSA and FCA, what's going to happen with brands like Jaguar Land Rover.
Yeah.
And I think VAG Group is you're absolutely right. There will be some tough conversations coming up soon about do we need to offer all of these brands that are underpinned essentially by the same technology? And also, as we move forwards, are those customer profiles going to be really as distinct as they were in the last 10 years? And I don't think they will be.
No, absolutely. And I take it back to 20 years ago. We did a piece of coursework at my retail management degree, and it was a planogram which we were asked by Revlon, the hair company, which is ironic given obviously my current state of affairs, to look at a planogram for a supermarket. And they gave us their kind of planogram for the next quarter. And we came up with a conclusion then that it was too busy and that, there was too much choice for the consumer. And by actually rationalizing some of these brands, you actually push people into, because the fact is, if you're of a certain hair, if you've got certain hair qualities, you're going to need products to look after it. But why make it more complicated just with slightly nuanced marketing edges to certain products? It just adds to the cost of manufacture. And I think, again, I've seen it in a couple of different brands that I've been working with over the last sort of few years, where they're starting to rationalize the type of equipment, starting to rationalize the type of color options, interior options, because they're kind of realizing, why are we offering these two-tone interiors that are made in such small, or at least taken up in such small numbers? It's just adding more cost to something that doesn't need to be there. And if you gross that up and look at it on a much wider scale, if you go and look at an Arona, a T-Roc, a Q2, and whatever the Skoda equivalent is, you're a bit more kind of car folks than I am, and you tell me the distinct difference of those products. They're all very, very capable cars and all very nicely styled, so on and so forth. But someone's going to have to tell me what the difference is for a consumer outside of that salesman was better, that consumer offer was slightly better, or that retailer was slightly sharper. That's what it's going to boil down to. And manufacturers don't necessarily, if they're cold about it, why are they leaving that sort of stuff to chance? They could probably do a bit more to rationalize some of that and make it a bit more efficient. It seems a bit fat really for the purpose.
Yeah. Let's just quickly talk about used cars, because during coronavirus, as we know, there have been some interesting trends that have sprung up. There's been the rediscovery of MPVs. People like those now. There's the high-end market, which has really taken off, and also camper vans and motorhomes. Now, this is something you've spoken about in your latest column. It's a short-term thing, though, isn't it? Because you only, like you alluded to in your column, and if nobody's read it, then please do go and read it, because if a vaccine does arrive, and we're all hoping one does arrive for coronavirus, this boom in staycations is suddenly going to reverse, isn't it? And there could be quite a large supply of motorhomes and camper vans re-enter the market next year and actually decrease values. It's interesting times we're in, really.
I think there's two parts to that question. The used car aspect, I think we were all hugely surprised. I mean, we were operating online sort of during the lockdown, the early stage of the lockdown period, and came back to online delivery quite quickly after that. And we were amazed. There was 1 month where the large bulk of what we were doing was really high value ticket items, and not to export or not to the good and the great of the land. It was to all sorts of different people, and that was a real sort of window into what was to come, and the fact that the used car market has been extremely buoyant. I saw your piece where you popped into Snow's to watch with them, all of the kind of BCA or whatever it was, and watching cars making absolute fortunes. My the only hypothesis I have to that is that typically during recessions, in my experience, people, baby boomers and older, tend to sort of hunker down with that sort of wartime mentality and say, actually, we're not going to spend our money. The investments are not going to mature at the rate that we need them to mature. So, they're out there buying cars because they've probably had a bit of an epiphany about life, thinking, I've seen friends or family members become very ill, and we need to do something to change that. And we want to sort of give ourselves some sort of, something to look forward to. So I think they're what's underpinning the current used car market. Typically they go away, but actually they're in force at the moment. And then moving on to the sort of camper van element, it was just, we've seen it here with Mercedes make a vehicle called the Marco Polo, which again is a very nice, thing. It's a van with a sink essentially, which is what most of these sorts of things are. And the prices that some of those have been achieving is unbelievable. And I just can't imagine that for the amount of people that are buying those vehicles right now, and not just those, but proper purpose-built motorhomes, that the lure of going to Margate every year for your summer holidays is something that's going to be here to stay, because once you've been to various parts of this country, as lovely as many of them are, you'll feel like you probably want to do it. And given and it's just the level of investment, some of these things are 100 grand. If you're using it for 3 weeks of the year, and there's, one thing that maybe come about is some sort of ownership sharing platform where, a kind of Airbnb for camper vans, that may even exist. Someone might be able to tell me that does exist. But, that's the sort of thing that I think, will really sort of catch some colds, where you suddenly realise you've got this massively expensive thing sat on your drive. You're using it for 3 weeks of the year. Right, I need to get rid of this. And then because they're so expensive, entry to that market is still largely exclusive for people who can afford it. And I think, that's why my sort of cautionary tale was I wouldn't necessarily be jumping into, 80,000 quid things. If it's your first time out, maybe start, with a 10 grand converted T28 or something, and then sort of see how you go with it. But certainly, the cost of these things is quite scary, really.
Yeah, yeah. Would you consider going back into the used car market and,
Oh yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to. The thing is, I think in order to make it in the future, it's going to be it's either very niche or scale, and that's retail in general. It's not just motor retail; that's retail in general. Very niche or scale, to kind of do something, with I don't love cars enough to be able to know, Porsches or Ferraris or some of these sorts of vehicles that people make a very good living out just doing a few cars at a time. But you need absolute intimate knowledge of those vehicles. I'm too much of a generalist to be able to make a living like that. So therefore, I need to do something at scale. And again, the capital cost of entry is just so big, not just in used car terms, and I think, again, coming back to points about manufacturers, manufacturers have over the last few years not necessarily done enough to diversify their networks, and there have been fewer new entrants and people with ambition. They're not exclusive, but on the whole. And so there are, working networks these days, there are a lot of PLCs, a lot of traditional historical family-based companies, and actually, those sometimes are a bit less dynamic. And I think, again, coming back to, people like me, and there'll be other people sat watching this who probably have got the same sort of aspiration. Yeah, I'd love to be able to do something that's bold and interesting, but actually it's very hard to achieve given what we do.
Yeah. Well, I think we're gonna have to leave it there, James. But
it's been good.
It's been lovely having you on, and also for lots of people to actually put a face to the words. Really, I'm sure it's really made their lunch, I think.
They've done something with their lunch, but I hope you make it.
But if you want to read James's column, please do. And I do urge you to go and download the latest issue of Car Deal. It's been totally redesigned, lots of fantastic content in there, and full details are on our website. Later this week, on Wednesday, we've got the UK MD of DS Automobiles. Don't miss that one. That's going to be pretty good. And on Friday, we're going to be talking used car values with CAP HPI's Darren Martin. Now, if you want to get involved in the show just like this one, please do email me, james.batchelor@blackballmedia.co.uk, or James Baggett. He's available at james@blackballmedia.co.uk. Until next time, thank you very much for watching, and bye-bye.